Hello everyone. Today, Biker Justice Analyst bring you a story full of humanity and compassion. Enjoy listening.
"Don't hurt me. I can't walk," begged poor women. Then a hell's angel changed everything. The rain drummed steadily against the metal awning of the bus stop, creating a hollow sound that matched the empty feeling in Maggie's chest. She pulled her thin jacket tighter, glancing down at Ella, who huddled close to her wheelchair. The 6-year-old's small hand rested on the armrest, her touch bringing comfort despite the cold evening air. "Mom, is the bus coming soon?" Ella asked, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Just a few more minutes, sweetheart," Maggie assured her, though she wasn't certain. The old wheelchair creaked as she shifted, the sound making her wince. They needed this bus to get home before dark, but it was running late. Heavy footsteps splashed through puddles, drawing closer. Maggie's heart skipped when she saw 3 men approaching, their faces hidden under dark hoodies. Something about their walk, their posture, sent chills down her spine. "Hey lady," one of them called out, his voice rough. "Got any spare change?" Maggie instinctively pulled Ella closer. "I'm sorry, I don't have anything." The men circled closer, like wolves around prey. The tallest one grabbed the handles of her wheelchair, giving it a sharp shake that made Ella gasp. "Come on, everyone's got something," he sneered, leaning down close enough that Maggie could smell alcohol on his breath. "Check her bag, please." Maggie's voice trembled as one of them reached for a purse. "Don't hurt me. I can't walk." She tried to keep her voice steady, to be brave for Ella, but fear made her words shake. "My daughter, please." The man holding her wheelchair laughed, a harsh sound that made Ella whimper. He gave the chair another push, harder this time, making the wheels screech against the concrete. Just then, a deep rumble cut through the rain. A motorcycle's headlight pierced the gloom, the bike pulling up to the curb with a growl. The rider was massive, his leather jacket bearing the unmistakable patch of a Hell's Angel. Even through the rain, the skull emblem seemed to glower at the harassers. The 3 men froze. The biker killed his engine and stood up, his boots hitting the ground with purpose. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His presence alone, tall and imposing in his leather cuts, sent the message clearly enough. The men backed away, muttering excuses. Within seconds, they had melted back into the rainy darkness, leaving only puddle ripples in their wake. The biker approached slowly, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. "You folks all right?" His voice was surprisingly gentle for such an intimidating figure. "Yes, thank you." Maggie managed, her heart still racing. She held Ella close, who peeked up at their unexpected savior with wide eyes. He knelt down, examining her wheelchair. "This thing's seen better days. Mind if I take a look?" Without waiting for an answer, he produced a small toolkit from his jacket pocket. His hands, despite their size, worked with surprising delicacy as he tightened loose bolts and adjusted the wheels. The bus arrived just as he finished, its headlights cutting through the rain. The biker helped Maggie board, ensuring she was secure before stepping back into the downpour. The next morning, Maggie sat in her kitchen, watching Ella eat breakfast. Her wheelchair moved smoother now, the familiar creak gone. The memory of last night's terror still lingered, but so did the unexpected kindness of the stranger. She found herself touching the newly tightened armrest, a small smile playing at her lips despite her lingering unease about accepting help from someone so unexpected. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. The morning sunlight filtered through the threadbare curtains of Maggie's small apartment. Her wheels squeaked softly against the worn linoleum as she made her way to the tiny kitchen. The familiar sound of cartoons drifted from the living room where Ellis sat cross-legged on their old couch, still in her pink pajamas. "Breakfast in 5 minutes, sweetie," Maggie called out, her voice warm despite her exhaustion. She couldn't shake the memory of last night, the terror of those men at the bus stop, and then the unexpected appearance of Jake, the Hell's Angel who'd come to their rescue. Her hands trembled slightly as she cracked eggs into a bowl. The image of Jake's weathered face and kind eyes contrasted sharply with his intimidating leather jacket and motorcycle. He'd fixed her wheelchair right there in the rain, his strong hands working quickly and efficiently while telling silly jokes to make Ella laugh. "Mommy, can I have extra cheese in my eggs?" Ella padded into the kitchen, her small feet making soft pattering sounds on the floor. "Of course, baby." Maggie smiled, reaching for the cheese in their nearly empty refrigerator. She noticed how the door didn't quite close properly anymore. Just another thing she couldn't afford to fix. As she whisked the eggs, Maggie's mind wandered back to Jake's offer to help with other repairs. Her pride stung at the thought of accepting charity, but the genuine kindness in his eyes had made her pause. She'd been managing on her own since her husband's passing, but lately, it felt like everything was falling apart faster than she could handle. "The eggs smell good," Ellis said, climbing onto her chair at their small kitchen table. "Do you think we'll see the motorcycle man again?" Maggie wheeled herself to the stove, pouring the egg mixture into the pan. "I don't know, sweetie. He was very nice to help us, but dash." A knock at the door cut her off. Ella jumped up excitedly. "I'll look through the peephole." "Ella, wait, dash," Maggie called out, but her daughter was already at the door, standing on tiptoe to peer through. "It's him, Mommy. The motorcycle man." Maggie's heart raced as she wheeled herself to the door. Through the peephole, she saw Jake standing there, holding a toolbox. He wore a plain black t-shirt today instead of his leather jacket, revealing arms covered in faded tattoos. "Who is it?" she called out, although she already knew. "It's Jake from last night." His deep voice carried through the door. "I noticed your door hinges were loose, and I brought my tools. Thought I might be able to help." Maggie bit her lip, looking down at Ella's hopeful face. The door hinges were indeed loose, making it difficult for her to manage in her wheelchair. She'd been meaning to call maintenance for weeks, but they never seemed to show up. "Please, Mommy," Ella whispered. "He's nice." After a moment's hesitation, Maggie reached for the door handle. "Just a minute," she called out, undoing the chain and lock. When she opened the door, Jake stood there with a gentle smile that softened his rough features. "Morning, Maggie." "Morning, Miss Ella." He held up his toolbox. "I hope I'm not interrupting breakfast." The smell of burning eggs suddenly reached Maggie's nose. "Oh no." She quickly wheeled herself back to the kitchen, where the eggs were starting to brown at the edges. "I can help," Ella announced, running to the stove. "Stay back from the stove, sweetheart," Jake said firmly but kindly from the doorway. "How about I fix these hinges first, then we can talk about what else needs attention around here." The drip from Maggie's kitchen sink had finally stopped. Jake wiped his hands on an old rag and stepped back from his work, a satisfied smile crossing his weathered face. "There you go. Good as new." Maggie wheeled closer to inspect the repair, her eyes widening at how easily the faucet now turned. "I can't believe it. That leak's been driving me crazy for months." "Sometimes the simplest fixes make the biggest difference," Jake said, putting his tools back into his worn leather bag. He settled into one of the mismatched kitchen chairs, his large frame making it look small. Ella peeked around the corner from the living room where she'd been coloring, curiosity written all over her young face. "Are you really a biker?" she asked, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Ella," Maggie scolded gently, but Jake just chuckled. "It's okay," he said, his eyes growing distant. "I was, for a long time." He ran a hand through his graying hair. "Being with the Hells Angels, well, it wasn't always the best choice I made." Maggie's hands tensed on her wheelchair armrests. "Why did you leave?" Jake was quiet for a moment, studying the worn linoleum floor. "Hit rock bottom about 5 years ago. Lost someone close to me because of the lifestyle." His voice grew softer, made me realize I needed to change, to do something different with my life. Ella had edged closer, now standing near her mother's wheelchair. Jake smiled at her, but Maggie could see the pain in his eyes as he continued. "Started helping out at a veteran center, fixing things for people who couldn't afford repairs. Found out I was pretty good at it." He shrugged. "Turns out helping folks feels a whole lot better than causing trouble." Maggie felt something shift inside her as she watched this big, tough man share his vulnerability. It must have been hard, leaving that life behind. "Hardest thing I've ever done," Jake admitted, "but worth it." Every day, I wake up knowing I'm trying to make things right. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. That's why I stopped last night. Couldn't just ride past when I saw you needed help. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty kitchen window, casting long shadows across the floor. Ella had settled at the table with her coloring book, seemingly comfortable with Jake's presence. I'm not used to accepting help, Maggie confessed, fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. After my husband passed, I promised myself I'd stay strong for Ella. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Being strong doesn't mean doing everything alone. Took me a long time to learn that myself. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the scratch of Ella's crayons on paper. Maggie found herself studying Jake's face. The lines around his eyes that spoke of both hardship and laughter. The gentle way he looked at Ella, the careful movements of his large hands that had fixed her sink with such precision. "Thank you," she said finally. "Not just for the sink, but for—" She gestured vaguely, "for sharing your story." Jake stood up, gathering his tools. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Maggie. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us of that." As he headed toward the door, Maggie felt torn between relief and anxiety. Part of her wanted to trust this man who had shown nothing but kindness, while another part still whispered caution. She watched as he gave Ella a gentle wave goodbye, his motorcycle boots surprisingly quiet on her worn carpet. Maggie sat at her small kitchen table, bills spread out before her like a depressing card game she couldn't win. The red final notice stamps seemed to mock her in the dim afternoon light. Her fingers trembled as she counted the money in her worn leather wallet for the third time, hoping somehow the numbers would change. "Mama, can we have pizza tonight?" Ella asked from the living room floor, where she was coloring with worn-down crayons. Maggie's heart squeezed. "Not tonight, sweetie. We'll have rice and beans, your favorite way, with extra cheese on top." She forced a smile, though Ella had already returned to her drawing. A knock at the door made Maggie jump. She quickly gathered the bills into a messy pile, stuffing them under a placemat just as Jake's familiar voice called out, "It's just me, Maggie." She wheeled herself to the door, checking through the peephole before opening it. Jake stood there in his usual leather jacket, but today he held a folder in his hands. "Thought I'd stop by," he said, stepping inside. His eyes swept over the hidden pile of bills, a corner of red peeking out from under the placemat. "Listen, Maggie, I know you're proud, and you should be. You're doing an amazing job with Ella. But there's help out there, if you're willing to take it." Maggie's cheeks burned. "I don't need charity," she whispered, conscious of Ella's presence in the next room. Jake pulled out a chair, sitting down at her eye level. "It's not charity. It's resources that exist specifically for families like yours. The community center downtown, they have programs, housing assistance, even job training. They helped me get back on my feet when I left the Angels." Maggie's hands twisted in her lap. The thought of asking for help made her stomach churn, but Ella's soft humming from the other room reminded her what was really at stake. I wouldn't even know where to start," she admitted quietly. "That's why I'm here," Jake said, opening the folder. "I can take you there today if you want. Just to talk, see what's available. No commitment." After a moment's hesitation, Maggie nodded. "Ella, honey, would you like to go for a ride with Mr. Jake and me?" The community center was busier than Maggie expected. People of all ages filled the waiting room, some with children, others alone. Jake helped navigate her wheelchair through the crowd to the front desk, where a kind-faced woman named Sarah greeted them. "We help lots of families in similar situations," Sarah explained, spreading out various pamphlets. "There's a housing assistance program that could help with rent, utility assistance, and even a job placement service that specializes in remote work opportunities." Maggie's eyes widened as Sarah continued listing resources. She'd had no idea such help existed. When Sarah mentioned a special grant for single mothers with disabilities, Maggie felt tears threatening to spill. "The waiting list can be long," Sarah warned gently, "but the sooner we get you registered, the better. Would you like to fill out some preliminary paperwork today?" Maggie looked at Jake, who gave her an encouraging nod, then at Ella, who was happily playing with some toys in the center's children's corner. Taking a deep breath, she turned back to Sarah. "Yes, please. I would." For the next hour, Sarah helped Maggie navigate through forms and applications. With each signature, the weight on Maggie's shoulders seemed to lift just a little. It wasn't a solution to everything, but for the first time in months, she felt something she hadn't expected: hope. The fluorescent lights of the community center buzzed overhead as Maggie wheeled herself through the double doors, Jake's steady presence behind her. The familiar smell of coffee and paper filled the air. A stack of forms sat in her lap, each page representing another step toward potential help. "Good morning, Maggie." Sarah, one of the staff members, waved from behind the front desk. Her warm smile helped ease some of Maggie's tension. "I see you brought all the paperwork." "Every last form," Maggie replied, patting the stack, "though I'm not sure I filled everything out right." Jake pulled up a chair next to Maggie at the desk. "That's what we're here for, to make sure everything's perfect." Sarah spent the next hour going through each document with Maggie, explaining terms she didn't understand and helping her correct small errors. Jake remained quietly supportive, occasionally asking questions Maggie hadn't thought to ask. "Now we just need to wait for the official response," Sarah explained, carefully organizing the completed forms into a folder. "It usually takes about dash." Before she could finish, another staff member hurried over, waving an envelope. "Maggie Thompson, this just came in for you." Maggie's hands trembled as she took the envelope. The community center's logo gleamed in the corner. She fumbled with the seal, her heart pounding. "Would you like me to?" Jake offered gently. "No," Maggie said, taking a deep breath. "I need to do this myself." The letter unfolded crisply in her hands. Her eyes scanned the first paragraph, then widened. I qualify," she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "They're going to help with housing." Jake's face broke into a broad grin. "That's fantastic." He reached out and squeezed her shoulder. Sarah clapped her hands together. "Congratulations, Maggie. I knew you qualify. This is just the first step, but it's a big one." Tears welled up in Maggie's eyes as she reread the letter. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt like she could breathe easier. The weight on her shoulders seemed a little lighter. "Thank you," she managed, looking at Jake and Sarah. "Both of you. I couldn't have done this alone." Later, as Jake wheeled her back toward her apartment, Maggie felt a strange mix of emotions washing over her. Pride at having taken this step, gratitude for the help she'd received, but also nagging doubt about the future. "You're awful quiet," Jake observed as they waited at a crosswalk. "Just thinking," Maggie replied, clutching the letter in her lap. "It feels good to have something go right for once." "But," she paused, struggling to put her feelings into words. "But you're wondering if you can handle everything else that comes next?" Jake finished for her. Maggie nodded, watching the traffic pass. "Exactly. What if I mess this up? What if I can't manage on my own?" "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for," Jake said, "and you're not alone anymore. Remember that." The afternoon sun warmed Maggie's face as they continued their journey home. The letter in her lap represented hope. Real, tangible hope. Yet beneath her growing confidence, questions still lurked. Could she really build a better life for herself? And Ella? Was she ready for this change? The familiar sight of her apartment building came into view, and Maggie felt the day's emotions settle into a cautious optimism. One step at a time, she told herself. One step at a time. Maggie sat at her small kitchen table, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the stack of housing assistance forms. Her fingers trembled slightly as she filled out yet another section. Ella was in the living room, humming softly while coloring in her favorite book. The forms seemed endless, but Maggie pressed on, determined to give her daughter the stability she deserved. She'd spent the morning copying down numbers, checking boxes, and initialing pages until her hand cramped. The community center had been helpful, but there was still so much paperwork to complete. The sharp ring of the telephone cut through the quiet apartment. Maggie wheeled herself over to answer it, recognizing the building manager's number on the caller ID. "Hello," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mrs. Wilson? This is Carl from management." The voice on the other end sounded apologetic. "I'm calling to inform you that the building has been sold to new owners. They're planning to renovate and convert the units to luxury apartments." Maggie's throat went dry. "What? What does that mean for current tenants? I'm sorry, but all residents will need to vacate within 60 days. You'll be receiving official notice in the mail tomorrow. The words hit her like a physical blow. Maggie's hand gripped the phone tighter as Carl continued talking about notice periods and tenant rights, but his voice seemed far away. All she could think about was Ella, her school, their tiny but comfortable home. When she finally hung up, the silence in the apartment felt deafening. Her earlier optimism about the housing assistance crumbled. Even if she qualified, finding a new place in just 2 months seemed impossible. The wheelchair made everything harder. So many buildings weren't accessible, and the few that were usually came with long waiting lists. Maggie wheeled back to the kitchen table, her movements mechanical. The paperwork that had seemed so important moments ago now felt pointless. She stared at the forms, vision blurring as tears threatened to fall. "Mommy," Ella's small voice came from the doorway. "Are you okay?" Maggie quickly wiped her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. Just tired from all this paperwork." She forced a smile, but her heart ached at the concern in her daughter's eyes. The phone rang again. Maggie almost didn't answer, but something made her reach for it. "Hey, Maggie." Jake's familiar voice was warm and steady. "I was thinking about stopping by tomorrow to look at that loose cabinet handle. Everything okay?" The kindness in his voice broke through her careful composure. "They're selling the building," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We have to leave in 60 days. There was a brief silence on the line. "Listen to me, Maggie," Jake said firmly. "We're going to figure this out. I know some people who might be able to help. Don't give up hope yet." "But what if?" "No what ifs. We'll find a solution." His confidence was unwavering. "I promise you won't have to handle this alone." When they hung up, Maggie sat quietly in her wheelchair, Jake's words echoing in her mind. The situation hadn't changed. They still had to move, and she still didn't know where they'd go. But somehow, knowing she had someone in her corner made the burden feel a little lighter. Ella came over and climbed into her lap, wrapping small arms around her neck. Maggie held her daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. Together, they sat in the fading sunlight, while outside their window, the city carried on, unaware of their small world shifting on its axis. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Maggie wheeled herself along the cracked sidewalk, with Ella skipping beside her. Yellow leaves danced around them, but Maggie barely noticed their beauty. Her mind was too full of worries about their uncertain future. "Look, Mommy." Ella pointed to a cardinal perched on a nearby fence. "It's so pretty and red." Maggie forced a smile. "Yes, sweetie, it is." She watched her daughter's innocent joy, her heart aching. How could she tell this precious child that they might not have a home soon? As they passed the local playground, Maggie's wheelchair caught on an uneven patch of concrete. She jerked forward, and her hands gripped the armrests tightly. Ella immediately reached out to steady the chair. "I got you, Mommy," Ella said with such mature concern that it made Maggie's throat tighten. "Thank you, baby." Maggie patted her daughter's hand, but inside her pride stung. Even her 6-year-old had to help her. The thought of accepting more help, especially from Jake, made her stomach churn with embarrassment. They continued their walk, passing familiar houses and shops. Each for rent sign they saw seemed to mock her. The prices were all way beyond what she could afford, even with assistance. "When is Jake coming over again?" Ella asked suddenly. "He makes you smile more." Maggie's chest tightened. "Oh, honey, I don't think we should depend on Jake so much. We can figure things out ourselves." "But he's nice to us," Ella protested. "And he fixed my toy car too." "I know, sweetie." Maggie sighed. "But we need to be strong on our own." Back at their apartment, Maggie tried to focus on making lunch, but her thoughts kept drifting to Jake's offers of help. He'd been nothing but kind, yet accepting his assistance felt like admitting defeat. The knock on the door came just as she was finishing the dishes. Through the peephole, she saw Jake's familiar figure, holding what looked like papers in his hand. Maggie hesitated before opening the door. "Jake, this isn't a good time." His eyes were kind but determined. "I found something, Maggie. There's an apartment complex on Oak Street that has wheelchair-accessible units. They work with the Housing Assistance Program." "Jake!" Maggie shook her head, wheeling back slightly. "I appreciate everything you've done, but I can't keep accepting your help." It's not right. Not right. Jake's brow furrowed. What's not right about letting people who care about you help? You don't understand, Maggie said, her voice tight. I've been taking care of myself and Ella for years. I can't just start depending on others now. Mommy, Ella appeared behind her, looking between them with worried eyes. It's okay, sweetheart, Maggie assured her. Mr. Jake was just leaving. Jake stood there for a moment, the papers still in his hand. At least take the information, he said quietly. You don't have to use it, but please just take it. Maggie stared at the offered papers, her hand trembling slightly as she finally accepted them. Without another word, she closed the door, hearing Jake's heavy boots retreat down the hallway. Later that afternoon, as Ellen napped on the couch, Maggie sat by the window, the untouched papers on her lap. The sun cast long shadows across the room, and she couldn't shake the image of Jake's disappointed face. Was she doing the right thing by pushing away someone who genuinely wanted to help? The question nagged at her as she watched the shadows grow longer, but she couldn't bring herself to pick up the phone and call him back. The kitchen walls seemed to close in around Maggie as she stared at the wrinkled eviction notice on her table. Her fingers traced the harsh black letters that spelled out 30 days to vacate. The morning sun streamed through the dusty window, casting long shadows across the paper that held her future in its cold, official words. A gentle knock on the door made her jump. Maggie? It's Jake. His familiar voice carried through the thin wood. She wheeled herself to the door, her chest tight with worry. When she opened it, Jake stood there in his usual leather jacket, but instead of tools, he held a stack of papers. I've got something to show you, he said, his eyes bright with purpose. Found a few places that might work for you and Ella. They're all near her school. Maggie's first instinct was to refuse. The words sat ready on her tongue. I can handle this myself. But the eviction notice burned in her mind, and Ella's worried face from breakfast this morning haunted her thoughts. She started, then stopped. Jake, I appreciate it, but just look, he said softly. That's all I'm asking. No commitments, no pressure. Just look. Maggie's hands gripped her wheelchair's armrests, her knuckles white with tension. The silence stretched between them until she finally nodded. Okay, she whispered. Just a look. Jake's truck was parked outside, modified with a wheelchair lift he'd installed himself. As he helped secure her chair, Maggie noticed how careful his movements were. This man, with his rough exterior and tattooed arms, handled her situation with such gentleness it made her throat tight with emotion. They drove through familiar streets, past the park where Ella loved to play. Jake pointed out different landmarks. There's the library you mentioned Ella likes, and that's the grocery store you usually shop at. Maggie watched the neighborhood roll by, her mind racing. Every fiber of her being screamed against accepting help, against showing weakness. But another voice, smaller but persistent, whispered, what if this is exactly what you need? You know, Jake said, breaking into her thoughts, when I first left the Angels, I thought asking for help meant I was weak. He kept his eyes on the road, but his voice carried years of understanding. It took me a long time to realize that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you can't do it all alone. His words hit home, and Maggie felt tears prick at her eyes. She thought about all the nights she'd stayed awake, worrying about bills, about Ella's future, about keeping their little family afloat. The weight of it all pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. I've been taking care of myself for so long, she admitted quietly. After Tom died, I promised myself I wouldn't depend on anyone else. But sometimes, she looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap. Sometimes it's so hard. Jake nodded, understanding in his silence. They turned onto a tree-lined street, and he slowed the truck. This is the first place, he said. It's got wide doorways, no steps, and a small garden Ella might like. As they pulled up to the modest house, Maggie felt something shift inside her. The fear was still there, the pride too, but alongside them grew something new, a tiny spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, accepting help didn't mean giving up her independence. Maybe it meant finding a different kind of strength. Ready to take a look? Jake asked, already moving to help with the wheelchair lift. Maggie took a deep breath and nodded. knowing that this moment might be bigger than just looking at a potential home. It might be the first step toward accepting that sometimes strength meant letting others in. The small apartment felt different from what Maggie had expected. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, warming the wooden floors. Her wheelchair glided smoothly across the surface as Jake held the door open, letting her explore each room at her own pace. "What do you think?" Jake asked, his voice gentle but eager. Maggie's hands rested in her lap as she took in the open layout. The kitchen counter was lower than usual, perfect for someone in a wheelchair. The bathroom had support bars already installed. Everything seemed possible. Maggie started, her voice catching. "It's nice." Ella darted from room to room, her excitement bubbling over. "Mom, look, this bedroom has a big window. Can I have this one?" Maggie felt her chest tighten. The thought of actually living here, of having a fresh start, made her both hopeful and terrified. Jake had found this place through his connections at the community center, and the rent was within what she might be able to afford with assistance. "There are 2 more places we could look at," Jake said, leaning against the doorframe. "But this one's got good bones. Plus, it's only 3 blocks from Ella's school." They visited the other apartments that afternoon. One was too far from everything, and the other needed too many modifications. But Maggie's mind kept drifting back to the first place. Still, every time Jake offered suggestions or mentioned ways he could help with the move, she felt that familiar wall go up. "I appreciate you showing me these places," Maggie said as they sat on a bench outside the last apartment. "But I need to figure out how to make this work on my own." Jake's expression softened. "You know, being independent doesn't mean doing everything by yourself." Maggie wheeled herself slightly away, focusing on a nearby tree. "I've been taking care of myself and Ella for years now. And you've done an amazing job," Jake said. "But sometimes life throws us a curveball, and it's okay to have someone in your corner." Later that evening, after Jake had dropped them home, Maggie sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she stared at the government grant application for disabled individuals. The form seemed to mock her with its complexity, but she forced herself to start filling it out. A job listing caught her eye. A small company needed someone to do data entry from home. The pay wasn't much, but it was something she could do despite her disability. With trembling fingers, she submitted her application. To her surprise, the company called back the next morning. The interview was short, conducted over the phone, and by afternoon, she had the job. It wasn't much, just 20 hours a week, but it was a start. Maggie sat in her wheelchair by the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. The grant application was complete, submitted with a prayer. The job would start next week. Small steps, but steps nonetheless. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "How did the interview go?" She stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keys. Pride told her to handle this alone, but something else, something that felt a lot like hope, made her type, "I got the job. Thank you for believing in me." Maggie sat at her small desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The morning sun filtered through her apartment window, casting a warm glow on her face. Her first week of working from home had given her a renewed sense of purpose. The data entry job wasn't glamorous, but each completed spreadsheet meant a steady paycheck. "Mommy, look what I drew." Ella bounced over, holding up a colorful crayon drawing. "It's you, me, and Jake at the park." Maggie's heart squeezed as she studied the picture. 3 stick figures smiled back at her. One in a wheelchair, a small one with pigtails, and a tall one wearing what looked like a leather jacket. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Why don't you show it to Jake when he comes over later?" "Really? He's coming." Ella's eyes lit up with excitement. Jake had been stopping by regularly to help with repairs around the apartment, and Maggie couldn't deny the change in Ella's demeanor whenever he visited. Her daughter had always been shy around strangers, but with Jake, she'd opened up like a flower in spring. The doorbell rang, right on schedule. Jake stood there with his toolbox, his usual warm smile in place. "Ladies," he greeted them, stepping inside. "How's the new job treating you, Maggie?" "It's good," she admitted, wheeling herself back to her desk. "Different from what I expected, but in a good way. The company's been very understanding about my situation." Ella tugged on Jake's sleeve. Look what I drew. She thrust the paper at him proudly. Jake crouched down to examine the drawing, his weathered face softening. Well, would you look at that? You've got quite the talent there, kiddo. Though you made me look much better than I actually do. Ella giggled, and Maggie found herself smiling too. She watched as Jake listened intently to Ella's detailed explanation of every crayon choice, treating each word as if it were precious. While Jake worked on fixing a loose cabinet door in the kitchen, Maggie noticed how natural it felt having him there. The initial tension that had filled her chest whenever he was around had gradually dissolved into something more comfortable. You know, Jake said, putting away his tools, there's a community barbecue this weekend at the center. Lots of families, good food, maybe some face painting for the little ones. He glanced at Ella, who was coloring nearby. Thought you both might enjoy getting out for a bit. Maggie's old instinct to decline kicked in, but she paused. The genuine care in Jake's eyes made her throat tight. I think we'd like that, she found herself saying. You're doing great, Maggie, Jake said softly, sitting down across from her. I know it's not easy, but you're stronger than you give yourself credit for. And you don't have to tackle everything alone. The simple sincerity in his words broke something loose inside her. Sometimes I feel like I'm barely holding it together, she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. That's okay too, Jake replied. Nobody's got it all figured out. But you've got people in your corner now. Maggie looked at her daughter, happily drawing at the coffee table, then back at Jake's steady presence. For the first time in years, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. She wasn't alone anymore, and maybe that wasn't such a scary thing after all. Thank you, she said quietly, and she meant it for more than just the cabinet repair. Jake nodded, understanding in his eyes. Anytime, Maggie, anytime. The warm glow of their small kitchen lamp cast gentle shadows across the walls as Maggie watched Ella color at the table. Tonight was special. They'd ordered Chinese takeout to celebrate Maggie's first paycheck from her new freelance job. The smell of sweet and sour chicken filled their tiny apartment. Can I have more rice, Mom? Ella asked, her crayon pausing mid-stroke on her drawing. Maggie wheeled herself to the counter, her chair moving more smoothly now thanks to Jake's repairs. Of course, sweetheart. She scooped another spoonful onto Ella's plate, her heart warming at her daughter's happy smile. The sound of motorcycle engines rumbled outside their window, and Maggie tensed for a moment before recognizing Jake's familiar knock at the door. Ella jumped up to answer it, but Maggie called out, "Wait, honey. Let me check first." Jake stood in the doorway, holding a small paper bag. "Thought you might like some fortune cookies," he said with a gentle smile. "Saw the takeout delivery guy earlier." "Jake," Ella exclaimed, ducking under Maggie's arm to hug him around the waist. Maggie felt her chest tighten with conflicting emotions, gratitude for his thoughtfulness, fear of depending too much on his kindness, and something else she wasn't ready to name. "Thank you. Would you like to join us?" They settled around the table, and Ella showed Jake her drawing, a picture of 3 stick figures, one in a wheelchair, one small, and one wearing what looked like a leather jacket. "That's beautiful, kid," Jake said, his voice softer than usual. He glanced at Maggie, who was staring at her plate, pushing rice around with her fork. "Something on your mind?" he asked. Maggie sighed, watching Ella return to her coloring. "It's just, everything feels so precarious. One minute I'm celebrating a new job, and the next I'm worried it could all disappear." Jake was quiet for a moment, cracking open a fortune cookie. "You know, that reminds me of when I first left the Angels. I'd built my whole life around them, and walking away meant starting from scratch. No safety net, no backup." Ella looked up, interested. "Were you scared?" "Terrified," Jake admitted. "But you know what I learned? Sometimes the scariest part isn't falling. It's letting yourself trust that someone will be there to catch you." Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she wheeled back from the table to get some water. "It's not that simple, Jake. I have Ella to think about. I can't just what? Accept help." Jake's voice was gentle but firm. "You know, I spent years thinking I had to prove I could make it on my own after leaving the gang. Pride nearly cost me everything." "What happened?" Maggie asked, despite herself. "An old pastor saw right through me. Told me accepting help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Changed my whole life when I finally listened." Ella yawned, and Maggie noticed the time. "Sweetie, time to get ready for bed." After Ella hugged them both good night and disappeared into her room, Jake stood to leave. "Just think about what I said, okay? You're not alone in this, Maggie. Not anymore." Maggie watched him walk to the door, his leather jacket catching the light. For the first time, she didn't see it as a symbol of danger, but of protection. "Jake," she called softly, "thank you for the fortune cookies and everything else." He nodded, understanding in his eyes, and closed the door quietly behind him. Maggie sat in the stillness of her apartment, looking at Ella's drawing still on the table. 3 figures together. Maybe she thought just maybe it was time to stop fighting so hard against the help being offered. The envelope trembled in Maggie's hands as she read the letter for the 3rd time. The words hadn't changed. "We regret to inform you that your application for housing assistance has been denied." Her throat felt tight, and her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. Ella was coloring at the kitchen table, humming softly to herself. Maggie glanced at her daughter, grateful that the 6-year-old was too absorbed in her artwork to notice her mother's distress. "Maybe I read it wrong," Maggie whispered to herself, smoothing the crumpled paper against her lap. But there was in black and white some missing document, an incomplete form, a bureaucratic detail she must have overlooked. The rejection felt like a physical blow. She wheeled herself to the small desk in the corner of their living room, where she kept all their important papers in a worn accordion file. Her hands shook as she pulled out folder after folder, searching for anything that might help her case. The phone rang, making her jump. It was Jake. "Hey, Maggie. Just checking in to see how you're doing." She swallowed hard. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice cracked on the second word. "What's wrong?" Jake's tone shifted from casual to concerned. "The housing assistants, they rejected my application." Saying it out loud made it real, and Maggie's carefully maintained composure began to crack. "I don't know what I'm going to do. The eviction notice, we only have 3 weeks left." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Jake said firmly. "No, you don't have to dash," but he had already hung up. Maggie stared at the phone, feeling a familiar mix of gratitude and shame. She'd already asked so much of him. The wheelchair repairs, the job leads, the housing applications. It seemed like every time she turned around, she needed his help with something else. True to his word, Jake arrived 20 minutes later. He took one look at the scattered papers around Maggie and pulled up a chair beside her. "Let me see the letter," he said gently. Maggie handed it over, watching as his eyes scanned the page. "It's just a technical issue," he said after a moment. "We can appeal this. I know someone at the community center who handles these kinds of situations all the time." "Jake," Maggie's voice was barely above a whisper. "I can't keep asking you for help. It's not fair to you." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Look, Maggie, this isn't about fair. This is about doing what needs to be done. You and Ella need a place to live." Ella looked up from her coloring book. "Are we going to have to move, Mommy?" Maggie's heart clenched. "I don't know, sweetheart. But don't worry, okay? Mommy's figuring it out." Jake reached for the phone. "Let me make that call about the appeal. It'll take 5 minutes." Maggie wheeled herself back from the desk. "I need to think about it first. Please." The words felt heavy in her mouth. I need some time." Jake nodded slowly, putting the phone down. "Okay, but promise me you'll let me know what you decide by tomorrow. These appeals have deadlines." "I promise," Maggie said, though the words felt hollow. After Jake left, she spent hours at her computer, searching for other options, other programs, anything that might help. But each possibility seemed to lead to another dead end, and the weight of uncertainty pressed harder on her shoulders with each passing hour. Maggie's wheelchair squeaked as she rolled away from the Housing Authority office, her hands trembling on the worn rubber grips. The fluorescent lights had been harsh, but the woman's words had been even harsher. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Walker, but with your income level and the current wait list, an appeal would be..." The housing officer had paused, adjusting her glasses. "Well, let's just say it would be unlikely to change anything." The morning sun did little to warm the chill that had settled in Maggie's bones. She'd barely made it halfway down the sidewalk when she heard the familiar rumble of Jake's motorcycle. "Hey there," Jake called out, parking his bike and jogging to catch up with her. How'd it go? Maggie kept her eyes fixed ahead. They said not to bother appealing. It's hopeless. Jake fell in his step beside her wheelchair. That's what they always say. But you know what? I've seen people win appeals plenty of times. The system tries to wear you down, make you give up. Maybe they're right, Maggie said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't have the energy to fight anymore. Jake stepped in front of her wheelchair, forcing her to stop. His leather jacket creaked as he crouched down to her eye level. Listen, Maggie, remember when my bike wouldn't start last week? Did I give up then? That's different. Maggie protested. No, it's not. Sometimes you gotta try even when everyone says it won't work. Jake pulled out a folder from his backpack. I did some research. Got the appeal forms right here. Maggie's throat tightened. Jake, I appreciate it, but nothing, he interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. Let me help you with this. We'll fill it out together. They found a quiet bench in the nearby park. Jake spread the papers out between them, explaining each section with patience. Maggie's pride wrestled with her desperation as she watched him point out where to sign. See here, Jake tapped a section of the form. This is where we explain your situation. We'll mention Ella's school, your job, everything that shows why you need to stay in this area. Maggie's hands shook as she gripped her pen. What if they just throw it away without reading it? Then we'll file another one, Jake said simply, and another after that if we have to. For the next hour, they worked through the paperwork together. Jake's rough hands, marked with old motorcycle grease, were surprisingly steady as he helped her organize the documents. Maggie felt her resistance slowly crumbling as they built their case together. There, Jake said finally, straightening the last page. Just need your signature here. Maggie stared at the dotted line. Her pen hovered above it as doubt gnawed at her resolve. You know, Jake said softly, accepting help doesn't make you weak. Sometimes it takes more strength to let others in than to keep pushing them away. Tears blurred Maggie's vision as she signed her name. The moment felt both terrifying and freeing, like stepping off a cliff and finding solid ground beneath her feet. Jake gathered the papers carefully, tucking them into an envelope. I'll drop this off at the housing office right now. They can't ignore a hand-delivered appeal. As she watched him walk toward the building, Maggie felt a curious mix of vulnerability and hope flutter in her chest. She'd done it. She'd let someone help her fight. Whether they won or lost, something had shifted inside her, like a rusty door finally creaking open. Maggie's hands trembled as she held the official-looking letter. The morning sunlight, streaming through her apartment window, seemed to mock the darkness spreading through her heart. Her eyes scanned the words again and again, but they remained unchanged. Appeal denied. What does it say, Mommy? Ella asked, her small face peering up from her bowl of cereal. Maggie's throat tightened. The paper crumpled slightly in her grip as she fought back tears. It's not good news, sweetheart. Ella pushed back her chair and walked over to her mother's wheelchair. With the intuition that only children possess, she wrapped her tiny arms around Maggie's shoulders. Don't cry, Mommy. We'll figure it out. The simple gesture of comfort from her 6-year-old daughter made Maggie's heart ache even more. She should be the one providing comfort and security, not the other way around. Tears spilled down her cheeks despite her best efforts to hold them back. I'm sorry, baby, Maggie whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I don't know what we're going to do. Ella patted her mother's back, just like Maggie did when Ella was upset. Maybe Mr. Jake can help us again? Maggie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Oh, honey, we can't keep depending on Jake. He's already done so much for us. The morning dragged on, heavy with uncertainty. Maggie couldn't focus on her work, her mind racing with possibilities, each one seeming more impossible than the last. The walls of their small apartment felt like they were closing in, reminding her that soon they wouldn't even have this space to call home. Around noon, a familiar knock echoed through the apartment. Ella rushed to open the door, and Jake's tall figure filled the doorframe. One look at Maggie's face told him everything he needed to know. The appeal didn't go through, he said. It wasn't a question. Maggie shook her head, unable to meet his eyes. We're out of options, Jake. He stepped inside, his usual confident demeanor somewhat subdued. There might be one more option, but he hesitated, which was unusual for him. There's a shelter on the east side of town. They have a program for families in need. Maggie's heart sank even further. The east side? But that's... She didn't finish the sentence. They all knew it was nearly an hour away from Ella's school, and even further from her new job. I know it's not ideal, Jake said softly, but it would give you a roof over your heads while we figure something else out. Ella looked between them, her small face pinched with worry. Will I have to change schools? Maggie pulled her daughter close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I don't know, sweetie. I just don't know. The weight of the situation pressed down on Maggie like a physical thing. The shelter would mean starting over completely, new neighborhood, new school for Ella, probably losing her job due to the distance. Everything they'd worked so hard to build would crumble. I'll leave you to think about it, Jake said, placing a pamphlet about the shelter on the kitchen table. Call me when you want to talk it through. After Jake left, Maggie sat in silence, staring at the pamphlet without really seeing it. Ella curled up on the couch with her favorite stuffed animal, unusually quiet. Outside, the sun continued its journey across the sky, oblivious to the storm raging in Maggie's heart. The evening settled around them like a heavy blanket, filled with unspoken fears and questions without answers. Maggie's wheelchair creaked as she moved to the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that seemed too beautiful for such a difficult day. The kitchen light cast long shadows across Maggie's face as she sat at her worn wooden table, staring at the stack of papers before her. Her fingers traced the edge of the shelter's brochure, its glossy surface reflecting the dim light. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking each moment she remained without an answer to her impossible situation. Ella's crayon drawings decorated the refrigerator, bright splashes of color that usually brought comfort, but now only reminded Maggie of everything she stood to lose. Her daughter slept peacefully in the next room, unaware of the weight pressing down on her mother's shoulders. It's too far, Maggie whispered to herself, her voice catching. 2 bus transfers just to get Ella to school. She pushed her wheelchair back from the table, the wheels squeaking slightly. The sound made her wince, another reminder of all the things she couldn't fix on her own. The knock at the door startled her. Jake stood there, his leather jacket slightly damp from the evening drizzle. His eyes were kind, but Maggie couldn't meet them. She wheeled back to let him in. You've been avoiding my calls, he said quietly, pulling up a chair next to her at the table. Maggie's hands twisted in her lap. I can't keep asking you for help, Jake. You've done too much already. The words felt thick in her throat. The shelter, it's the only option left, but it's so far from everything. From Ella's school, from my new job. She paused, fighting back tears. I'm supposed to protect her, provide for her. Instead, I'm failing at everything. Jake leaned forward, his expression serious. Maggie, look at me. He waited until she raised her eyes. You're not failing. You're fighting. There's a big difference. But I can't even... Maggie's voice broke. I can't even give her a stable home. What kind of mother am I? The kind who puts her daughter first, Jake said firmly. The kind who works hard and never gives up. That's exactly the mother Ella needs. Tears spilled down Maggie's cheeks. I'm so tired of being a burden to everyone. To you, to the community center, to... Stop right there. Jake interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. You're not a burden. You never have been. He reached across the table, not touching her, but close enough to show his support. Having people who want to help doesn't make you weak, Maggie. It makes you human. Maggie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. But the shelter, we'll figure something out, Jake assured her. But first, you need to think about what's best for Ella. Not your pride, not what you think you should be able to do alone. What's best for your daughter? The question hung in the air between them. Maggie looked toward Ella's room, where her daughter's soft breathing could be heard through the thin walls. The crayon drawings on the fridge seemed to blur through her tears. I just want her to be safe, Maggie whispered, to have a chance at a normal life. Jake nodded slowly. Then let me help you give her that. I'm not going anywhere, Maggie. Whether you take the shelter option or we find another solution, I'll be here to support you both. Maggie sat in silence, Jake's words sinking in. The ticking clock marked the passing moments as she struggled with the decision before her. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Maggie sat in the shelter's intake office. Her wheelchair felt especially heavy today, weighted down by the reality of her situation. The shelter coordinator, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Peterson, spread several forms across the desk between them. "We can offer you temporary housing for up to 3 months," Mrs. Peterson explained, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. "It's not ideal. You'll share a room with another resident, but you'll have your own bed, and there's space for Ella too." Maggie's throat tightened as she looked at the forms. The shelter's address was on the other side of town, far from everything familiar. And you said there's wheelchair access?" "Yes, though it's basic. The building is older, but we've made accommodations." Mrs. Peterson paused, studying Maggie's face. "I know this isn't what you hoped for, but it's safe, and it's a start." The door opened, and Jake stepped in, his leather jacket creaking as he took a seat next to Maggie. She hadn't expected him to come, but here he was just like always. "Before you sign anything," Jake said, pulling out a folded brochure from his pocket, "there's something else you should consider." He handed the paper to Maggie. "It's called the New Horizons program. They work with disabled individuals who are at risk of homelessness." Mrs. Peterson's eyes lit up with recognition. "Oh yes, I'm familiar with them. They're excellent." Maggie's hands trembled as she opened the brochure. What exactly do they do?" "They provide temporary housing while helping you get back on your feet," Jake explained. "But it's more than just a roof. They offer job training, financial counseling, and help with permanent housing placement. The program runs for 6 months. 6 months. Maggie's voice quivered. It seemed like such a long time to accept help. "The best part," Jake continued, leaning forward, "is they have a property just 3 blocks from Ella's school. You wouldn't have to uproot her life completely." Mrs. Peterson nodded encouragingly. "That would be much better than our shelter for your situation, Maggie. The program has a high success rate." Maggie stared at the brochure, her vision blurring with tears. The thought of accepting such comprehensive help made her chest tight with anxiety. But she thought of Ella, her sweet girl who deserved stability. There's probably a long waiting list," Maggie whispered. Jake shook his head. "Already called them. They have an opening right now, but we need to act fast." Maggie looked up at him, surprised. "You did that for us?" "Of course I did." Jake's voice was gruff but kind. "You deserve a real chance, not just a temporary fix." Mrs. Peterson gathered up the shelter forms. "Maggie, I think you should consider this opportunity. The New Horizons program could be exactly what you need." Maggie's hands clenched in her lap as she thought about it. 6 months of help. 6 months of letting others support her. 6 months of swallowing her pride. But also 6 months of hope for a better future. "Okay," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll try the program." Jake's face broke into a relieved smile. "That's the bravest decision you could make, Maggie." Mrs. Peterson stood up, gathering her papers. "I'll call them right now to get the process started. You're making the right choice." As they left the shelter office, Maggie felt the familiar weight of uncertainty, but something else too, a tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, this time things would be different. The community center bustled with activity as Maggie wheeled through its double doors. Her hands trembled slightly on the rubber grips of her wheelchair, but she managed a small smile at the receptionist who greeted her warmly. "Welcome to our Fresh Start program, Maggie," said Sarah, a kind-faced staff member who wore a bright blue name tag. "We're so glad you decided to join us." The meeting room was filled with about 15 other people, some in wheelchairs like her, others dealing with different challenges. Maggie positioned herself near the back, trying to make herself invisible, but a woman about her age waved her over to an empty spot at her table. "First time?" the woman asked with a knowing smile. "I'm Patricia. Been coming here for 3 months now." Maggie nodded, surprised by the immediate friendliness. Does it really help?" Patricia's eyes lit up. "I was living in my car when I first came here. Now I have my own apartment and a part-time job I can do from home." She patted Maggie's hand. "They don't just help with housing. They teach you how to be independent again." Throughout the morning, Maggie listened to success stories from other program participants. A former veteran spoke about overcoming homelessness, while a young mother shared how she'd learned to manage her finances after a divorce. Each story sparked a tiny flame of hope in Maggie's chest. During the break, Jake appeared with 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, placing one carefully on her table. "How's it going?" "It's different than I expected," Maggie admitted, warming her hands around the cup. These people understand what it's like. They don't judge. The afternoon session focused on practical skills, budgeting, job searching, and housing applications. Maggie found herself taking detailed notes, her earlier nervousness replaced by determination. When Martha, the housing coordinator, announced she had several new listings available, Maggie was one of the first to raise her hand. "There's a ground floor unit that just opened up," Martha said, showing Maggie some photos. "It's small, but it's wheelchair accessible and only 3 blocks from Ella's school." Maggie's heart quickened as she looked at the pictures. The apartment wasn't fancy, just a simple 2-bedroom with basic amenities, but it was clean and well-maintained. The rent was within her budget, especially with the housing assistance she'd qualify for through the program. "We could go see it tomorrow if you'd like," Martha offered. "The program will help with the security deposit, and we can have you moved in by next week." Tears welled up in Maggie's eyes as she nodded. Jake, who had stayed nearby throughout the day, squeezed her shoulder gently. "See," he said softly, "sometimes asking for help leads to exactly what you need." As the session wrapped up, Maggie found herself exchanging phone numbers with Patricia and 2 other women from the group. They made plans to meet for coffee the following week, and for the first time in years, Maggie felt like she was part of a community that truly understood her struggles. Wheeling toward the exit, Maggie paused to look at the bulletin board covered with success stories. Photos of smiling faces and handwritten testimonials filled the space. Maybe someday soon, she thought, her story would be up there too. "Ready to go check out that apartment tomorrow?" Jake asked as they left the building. Maggie looked up at him, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "Yes," she said firmly. "I think I am." Maggie sat in her wheelchair, surrounded by cardboard boxes in various states of being packed. The afternoon sun streamed through the apartment windows, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. She watched as Ella carefully wrapped their few precious photo frames in old newspapers. "Mama, remember this one?" Ella held up a slightly faded photograph of them at the park last summer. "That was when the ice cream man gave me an extra scoop." Maggie smiled, her eyes growing misty. "I remember, sweetheart. You were so happy that day." She wheeled closer to her daughter, gently taking the frame. "We've made some good memories here, haven't we?" "Yeah, but we'll make new ones in our new home, right?" Ella's innocence and optimism never failed to touch Maggie's heart. "That's right, baby." Maggie reached out and squeezed her daughter's hand. Looking around at their modest belongings, she felt a surprising lightness in her chest. Just a few months ago, the thought of moving had filled her with dread and shame. Now, though the future wasn't perfect, it held promise. A gentle knock at the door made them both look up. Jake stood in the doorway, his leather jacket draped over one arm. Despite his intimidating size, his smile was warm and gentle. "Thought you ladies might need some help with the packing," he said, stepping inside. "I brought some extra boxes and tape." "Jake!" Ella ran to him, wrapping her arms around his legs in a tight hug. "Look at all our boxes. We're getting really good at packing." Jake chuckled, ruffling her hair. "I can see that, kiddo. You're doing a great job." Maggie watched them, her heart full. She remembered how terrified she'd been when she first met Jake that rainy night at the bus stop. How wrong she'd been to judge him by his appearance. This man, with his Hell's Angels past and rough exterior, had shown her more kindness than she'd experienced in years. "Jake, Maggie's voice caught in her throat. "I don't know how to thank you for everything." He shook his head, already moving to help with a particularly heavy box. "No need for thanks, Maggie. Everyone deserves a chance to start fresh. Sometimes we just need a little help getting there." As they worked together, sorting through years of accumulated memories, Maggie found herself sharing stories about each item they packed. The chipped teacup that had belonged to her mother, the handmade blanket from when Ella was born, the small collection of seashells from their only beach vacation. "You know," Jake said, carefully wrapping the teacup, Moving isn't just about packing up stuff. It's about choosing what to carry forward with you. Ella looked up from her task of organizing her stuffed animals. Like memories? Exactly like memories, sweetheart, Maggie replied, reaching out to stroke her daughter's cheek. And the people who helped make those memories special. Jake stood up, brushing dust from his jeans. I've got my truck ready whenever you need it. We can start moving these boxes first thing tomorrow morning. Maggie felt tears welling up in her eyes, but for once, they weren't tears of frustration or fear. Thank you, Jake. Not just for the truck, but for everything. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. That's what friends are for, Maggie. That's what friends are for. The morning sun peeked through the curtains of Maggie's old apartment as Jake's pickup truck rumbled to a stop outside. Ella bounced excitedly near the window, her small backpack already strapped on. He's here, Mommy. Can I go say hi? Maggie smiled, adjusting her wheelchair. Of course, sweetie. Just be careful on the stairs. Their few belongings sat in neat piles around the small living room. Some boxes of clothes, kitchen items, and precious photos. It wasn't much, but it was their life, ready to be transported to their new beginning. Jake appeared in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. Despite his rough appearance, the leather jacket and faded jeans, his eyes were gentle. Ready for moving day, ladies? As ready as we'll ever be, Maggie replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. They worked together like a well-oiled machine. Jake carried the heavier boxes while Ella proudly transported smaller items, treating each one like treasure. Maggie directed traffic from her wheelchair, making sure everything was properly organized in the truck. The kitchen stuff goes in last, she called out. We'll need that first when we get there. The morning passed quickly, and soon they were pulling up to their new home, a modest first-floor apartment with wide doorways perfect for Maggie's wheelchair. The landlord had even installed a small ramp at the entrance. Look, Mommy, Ella ran to the front door. We have our own little garden. She pointed to the small patch of earth near the entrance. Maggie felt tears welling up as she wheeled herself inside. The space was small but clean, with sunlight streaming through large windows. The kitchen opened into a cozy living room, and two small bedrooms weighted down a short hallway. As Jake brought in boxes, Maggie began unpacking the kitchen items. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed plates in the cupboards. This was real. This was happening. They had a home again. Hey, Jake's voice was soft as he set down another box. You okay? Maggie wiped her eyes quickly. Yes, I never thought we'd be here. A few months ago, everything seemed so hopeless. Ella darted between them, clutching her favorite stuffed bear. Can I put my books in my room now? Please. Of course, Maggie laughed. Jake, would you mind helping her reach the higher shelves? As evening approached, the apartment slowly took shape. Pictures found their places on walls, clothes filled drawers, and Ella's room transformed into a cozy nest of books and toys. The smell of pasta sauce filled the air as Maggie prepared a simple dinner in their new kitchen. They sat around the small dining table, a housewarming gift from the community center, sharing their first meal in their new home. The pasta wasn't fancy, but it tasted like victory. Thank you, Maggie said quietly, looking at Jake. For everything. I know I wasn't always the easiest person to help. Jake shook his head. You're stronger than you know, Maggie. You just needed someone to remind you of that. Ella looked between them, twirling spaghetti on her fork. Are we going to be okay now, Mommy? Maggie reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. Yes, sweetheart. We're going to be just fine. The setting sun cast long shadows through their new windows, painting the walls in warm oranges and pinks. As they sat together, sharing this simple meal, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Peace. It wasn't just the new apartment or the stability it represented. It was the knowledge that they weren't alone anymore. Maggie's hands trembled as she held the official-looking envelope from the housing authority. Sunlight streamed through the small window of her apartment, casting a warm glow on the kitchen table where she sat. Ella was at school, and the morning silence felt heavy with anticipation. Taking a deep breath, she carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Her eyes scanned the first paragraph, and tears began to well up. But these weren't tears of despair. They were tears of joy and relief. The housing assistance had been approved. Finally, after months of uncertainty and fear, she had the stability she'd been desperately seeking. "Thank you, God," she whispered, pressing the letter to her chest. The weight that had been crushing her for so long began to lift. She wouldn't have to worry about having a roof over Ella's head anymore. They could stay in their small but cozy apartment, close to Ella's school and her work. Maggie wheeled herself to the window and looked out at the neighborhood she'd grown to love. The old maple tree outside was beginning to show its fall colors, and Mrs. Peterson from next door was tending to her small garden of late-blooming flowers. This was home now, really and truly home. Her thoughts turned to Jake. Without him, none of this would have been possible. He'd been there through every step, from fixing her broken wheelchair that rainy night to helping her navigate the complex world of housing assistance. His rough exterior had hidden a heart of gold, and his persistence had helped her overcome her own stubborn pride. Maggie moved to her small desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. She needed to tell Jake what this meant to her, how much his help had changed their lives. The words flowed easily as she began to write. "Dear Jake, I received the final approval letter today. We can stay in our apartment. I know these words aren't enough to express how grateful I am, but I need to try. When you found us that night at the bus stop, I was scared and suspicious. I couldn't understand why a Hell's Angel would want to help someone like me. But you showed me that appearances don't tell the whole story, and that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. You taught me that accepting help isn't a weakness, it's a strength. Every time I pushed you away, you came back with patience and understanding. You showed me what true kindness looks like, and you helped me create a better life for Ella. I used to think I had to do everything alone to prove I was strong. Now I know that real strength comes from being brave enough to let others in. You helped me learn that lesson, Jake, and it's changed everything. Thank you for being there, for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself, and for showing me that second chances are possible for everyone. With deepest gratitude, Maggie." She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into an envelope. The simple act of writing down her feelings had made her realize just how far she'd come. From that terrifying night at the bus stop to this moment of security and hope, every step had been a lesson in trust and growth. Her wheelchair didn't seem quite so heavy anymore, and the world didn't feel quite so daunting. She had learned that sometimes the scariest part of any journey was accepting that you didn't have to face it alone. Sunlight streamed through the small window of Maggie's new apartment, casting a warm glow across her desk where she worked. Her fingers moved steadily across the keyboard as she typed, pausing only to adjust her wheelchair or glance at Ella, who sat nearby doing her homework. "Mom, look what I made at school today." Ella bounced over, holding up a colorful drawing. The paper showed 3 stick figures, one in a wheelchair, one small figure, and one wearing what looked like a leather jacket. Maggie's heart swelled. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Is that Jake with US?" "Uh-huh." Ella beamed. "Ms. Thompson asked us to draw people who make us happy." The moment touched Maggie deeply. These past few months had transformed their lives in ways she never expected. Her freelance work was steady now, providing a reliable income that complemented her disability benefits. The community center had become a second home, where she spent several hours each week helping others navigate the same challenges she'd faced. Just yesterday, she'd sat with a young mother who'd lost her job, showing her how to apply for assistance programs and sharing her own story of survival. The woman's tears of relief reminded Maggie of herself not so long ago, when she'd been too proud to accept help. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Hey there." Jake's familiar voice came through. "Got time for a visitor?" "Always," Maggie answered warmly. "Ella just finished her homework, and I'm wrapping up work myself." 20 minutes later, Jake's motorcycle rumbled into the parking lot. Ella rushed to the window, waving enthusiastically. He appeared at their door moments later, carrying a small bag of groceries, a habit he'd developed since they'd moved in. "The place looks great," Jake commented, noting the new curtains Maggie had sewn herself and the small herb garden starting to grow in the kitchen window. "You've really made it home." Maggie wheeled herself to the kitchen table, where Jake was unpacking fresh vegetables. It feels like home now. I never thought I'd say that again, but here we are. Here we are. Jake agreed, his usually gruff voice softening. You know, I see you at the community center these days more than I see some of my old writing buddies. Those people there, they remind me of myself, Maggie said, helping Ellis set the table. Scared, proud, not wanting to admit they need help. If I can make their journey a little easier, show them there's no shame in accepting support. She paused, emotion catching in her throat. Jake nodded, understanding in his eyes. You're giving them something I try to give you, permission to let others in. And look how well that turned out. Maggie smiled, gesturing around their cozy apartment. I went from barely surviving to truly living. Ella's happier. I'm working. We have a real home. She reached over and squeezed Jake's hand. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I try to push you away. That's what family does, Jake replied simply, making Ella giggle with delight. As they shared a simple dinner together, Maggie felt a deep sense of contentment. The fear and isolation that had once defined her life had been replaced by something stronger, community, purpose, and the knowledge that accepting help wasn't weakness, but rather the first step toward real strength. The spring sun warmed Maggie's face as she watched Jake spread a checkered blanket on the grass. Her wheelchair rested comfortably on the paved path next to their chosen picnic spot, under a blooming cherry tree. The park bustled with life, children playing, dogs barking, and families enjoying the beautiful weather. Can I help with the basket? Ella asked, bouncing on her toes beside Jake. Sure thing, kiddo. Jake handed her the lighter side of the wicker basket, and together they placed it on the blanket. Perfect spot, right here in the shade. Maggie smiled, watching them work together. It amazed her how naturally Jake had become part of their lives. He helped her transfer from her wheelchair to the blanket, his movements gentle and practiced. The same hands that once belonged to a Hell's Angel now carefully arranged pillows behind her back for support. I made the sandwiches myself, Ella announced proudly, pulling out carefully wrapped packages. Did you now? Jake raised an eyebrow, accepting one from her small hands. Let's see how they measure up to your mom's. Maggie laughed. She's been practicing, though I had to stop her from adding pickles and peanut butter together. That would have been an interesting combination, Jake chuckled, taking a bite of his sandwich. This is much better, perfect amount of everything. They ate together, sharing stories and jokes. Ella told them about her new friend at school, acting out their playground adventures with dramatic gestures. Jake shared funny stories about fixing motorcycles, carefully editing out the rougher parts of his past for Ella's ears. Maggie watched them both, her heart full. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued her just months ago felt distant now. Her new apartment, though small, had become a real home. Her work was steady, and Ella was thriving at school. But more than the practical improvements, it was this sense of belonging that moved her most deeply. A light breeze rustled through the cherry blossoms above them, sending pale pink petals dancing through the air. Ella jumped up, trying to catch them, her laughter carrying across the park. Look at her go, Jake said softly, watching Ella chase the falling petals. She's something special, that one. Maggie nodded, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Jake, she began, her voice thick with emotion. I need to thank you. He turned to her, his expression gentle. Maggie, no, please let me say this. She took a deep breath. You changed our lives. That night at the bus stop, you could have just scared those men away and left. But you stayed. You helped us when I was too proud to ask for it. You showed me that accepting help doesn't make me weak. It makes me stronger. Jake's eyes softened. You did all the hard work, Maggie. I just pointed you in the right direction. You did so much more than that, Maggie insisted. You showed us that good people can come from unexpected places. You taught me to trust again. Ella ran back to them, her hands full of cherry blossoms. Look what I caught. She dropped the petals over their heads, giggling as they fell like pink snow. Jay caught one and tucked it behind Ella's ear. Perfect, he said, and Maggie knew he wasn't just talking about the flower. They stayed in the park until the sun began to sink, painting the sky in warm oranges and pinks. Their laughter mixed with the evening breeze, carrying the promise of more days like this to come. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window of Maggie's apartment, casting a warm glow on the envelope in her trembling hands. Her heart raced as she carefully opened the letter from the company she'd been freelancing for over the past few months. "Dear Mrs. Margaret Wilson," she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "We are pleased to offer you a permanent position." Tears welled up in her eyes as she continued reading. The salary they offered was more than she'd ever hoped for, and they would let her continue working from home. Her wheelchair creaked softly as she rolled back from the kitchen table, overwhelmed by emotion. "Ella," she called out, her voice cracking. "Sweetheart, come here." 6-year-old Ella came running from her bedroom, her pigtails bouncing. "What is it, Mommy?" Maggie pulled her daughter into a tight hug. "Remember how Mommy was worried about her job?" She held up the letter. "Well, they wanted to work for them forever. Forever and ever." Ella's eyes widened with delight. "That's right, baby." Maggie wiped away a happy tear. "We don't have to worry anymore." She reached for her phone and dialed Jake's number with shaking fingers. When he answered, his deep voice was warm and familiar. "Hey, Maggie, everything okay?" "Everything's wonderful," she said, unable to keep the joy from her voice. "Could you come over? I have something to tell you." 20 minutes later, Jake's motorcycle rumbled to a stop outside their apartment. He knocked on the door, and Ella raced to let him in, throwing herself into his arms. "Uncle Jake, Mommy got good news." Jake's leather jacket creaked as he scooped Ella up, his eyes meeting Maggie's. "Is that so?" Maggie held out the letter, watching as Jake's eyes scanned the page. His face broke into a wide smile, the kind that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "This is amazing, Maggie. You did it. We did it." She corrected him, thinking of all the times he'd encouraged her, supported her, believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. "I wouldn't be here without you, Jake." "Nah," he said, setting Ella down gently. "You had it in you all along. You just needed someone to remind you how strong you are." Ella tugged at Jake's jacket. "Can we have ice cream to celebrate?" Jake looked at Maggie, raising an eyebrow. "What do you say, Mom? Ice cream for breakfast?" Maggie laughed, a sound full of joy and freedom. "You know what? Why not? Today is special." As they sat around the kitchen table, sharing a carton of vanilla ice cream, Maggie looked at her little family. Ella was giggling as Jake pretended his spoon was an airplane, and sunlight danced across their faces. The moment felt perfect, not because everything was perfect, but because they were together. She thought about that rainy night at the bus stop, when she'd been so scared and alone. Who could have known that the very person who seemed the most intimidating would turn out to be her guardian angel? That a former Hell's Angel would help her find not just stability, but also friendship and hope? Pride swelled in her chest. Not the kind that had once kept her from accepting help, but the kind that came from knowing she'd faced her fears and come out stronger. She had a home, a job, and most importantly, people who cared about her. "More ice cream, Mommy?" Ella asked, holding out a spoonful. Maggie smiled, accepting the offered bite. "Thank you, sweetheart." She caught Jake's eye across the table and saw her own happiness reflected there. This was what it felt like to truly make it. The evening sun painted the sky in shades of pink and orange as Maggie sat by her apartment window. Her wheelchair was positioned perfectly to catch the last warmth of the day, and she wrapped her hands around a steaming cup of tea. From her spot, she could see children playing in the courtyard below, their laughter floating up to her third-floor window. 6 months had passed since she'd moved into this apartment. The walls now held family photos, including several of Ella's artwork proudly displayed on the refrigerator. The space wasn't huge, but it was home, a real home filled with love and security. Maggie took a slow sip of her tea, remembering the night that changed everything. The rain, the terror, the helplessness she'd felt when those men surrounded her at the bus stop. She could still hear her own trembling voice. "Don't hurt me. I can't walk." But that moment of absolute vulnerability had led to something unexpected. Jake's arrival on his motorcycle, like some leather-clad guardian angel. A smile tugged at her lips as she thought about how far she'd come. The letter offering her a permanent position at work lay on the coffee table, its official letterhead catching the fading sunlight. Her fingers had trembled when she'd opened it this morning, but now it represented so much more than just job security. It was proof that she could stand on her own, metaphorically speaking, while still accepting the support of others. The sound of keys in the door pulled her from her thoughts. Ella burst in, followed by Jake, who'd picked her up from her after-school program. Her daughter's backpack was covered in fresh stickers, and her eyes sparkled with excitement as she rushed to show Maggie her art project. "Mom, look what I made." Ella held up a colorful drawing of 3 figures. One in a wheelchair, one small and holding hands of the first, and a third wearing what was unmistakably a leather jacket. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Maggie said, her voice thick with emotion. She caught Jake's eye over Ella's head, and he gave her that familiar warm smile that had become such a constant in their lives. Looking at them both, Maggie felt the full weight of her transformation. She remembered how she'd once pushed everyone away, convinced that accepting help meant admitting defeat. Now she understood that strength wasn't about doing everything alone. It was about having the courage to let others in. "I've got some good news," Maggie said, reaching for the letter on the coffee table. "They've offered me a permanent position at work." Jake's face lit up. "That's fantastic, Maggie. We should celebrate." "Pizza." Ella cheered, bouncing on her toes. Maggie laughed, a sound that came easily now. "Pizza it is." As Jake called in their order, Maggie watched him and Ella settling into their usual routine. Ella pulling out her homework, Jake offering to help while still on the phone. The scene was so normal, so comfortable, yet it represented everything she'd once thought impossible. The sunset had deepened to purple now, casting long shadows across her living room floor. But unlike the shadows of her past, these weren't frightening. They were just part of the natural rhythm of her days, like the ebb and flow of accepting help when she needed it and offering strength when others did. Maggie wheeled herself away from the window and toward her family. The fear that had once paralyzed her more than her physical condition was gone, replaced by a deep sense of peace. She was no longer that terrified woman at the bus stop, no longer alone in her struggles. She had found her way home. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.